A very good morning to you and welcome to Just Africa. Today we are looking at the program that brings to you unfiltered realities, economic truths and policy impacts in shaping the lives of everyday Africans. Today we turn our lenses to a crisis that cuts across borders and currencies and classes and inflation, and how it's taking its toll on the African consumer from Lagos to Johannesburg, Cairo to Algiers, and all to Addis Ababa. Rising prices are squeezing households, budgets, and eroding the wages and reshaping consumption habits. Whether it's the cost of a loaf of bread, a tank of fuel, or monthly rent, millions of African families are asking the same question: how much can we deal with this? In this edition, we focus on Africa's 5 largest economies. We'll be looking at more than 5. Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, Algiers, Ethiopia, Kenya, and how each is navigating its own inflation and its storm. We'll examine how government reforms, currently devaluation of the currency, and the global shocks are driving prices. The real impact of consumers from shrinking shopping baskets to rising debt services and the debt, including inflation, and what recent economic rebasing in countries like Nigeria and Kenya, Algeria, tells us about how true it shaped their economies. Is inflation a temporary storm or a new normal for African households? That question needs to be asked and needs to be answered. And what does it mean for the continent in the future, economically and politically? Stay with us as Just Africa breaks down the numbers, the policies, and the human stories behind the cost of living, the crisis sweeping across African economy. Is Nigeria truly the giant of Africa? That question sounds rhetorical, but it's left for you and I to answer. Because good morning to you.
Good morning.
Welcome. Yes, please.
Good morning. I am Olumide Sokoya. I made mention of something like that Nigerians, we need to start acting. I wanted to say, are we truly the giants of Africa? But we are the giants of Africa. If you look at it, the resources we have and all that, we are the giants of Africa. So I would say yes.
Okay. So the thing is, one of the things I intend to look at is that maybe Nigeria is the giant of Africa population-wise. But is it the giant of Africa economically? Maybe it could be the giant of Africa when it comes to trade. But is it the giant of Africa when we talk about manufacturing? So maybe it's the giant of Africa in another aspect, but political management, governance, policy reforms, implementations of these policies, and budget performance. Does it reflect that giant strides? Does it give out the disposition as the giant of Africa? Now, Nigeria is not the only country we are looking at here. We're looking at Kenya. We'll look at Algeria. We'll look at Ethiopia. Are they really the kind of countries that say, this is who we are? Probably an organization is telling you, this is who we are. Are you really reflecting that proclamation, that thing you said of yourself, that this is who we are and this is who I am? So that's one of the things I would like to entertain. This is inflation we are talking about. So what is even inflation? It is where it is a situation where the prices of goods and services skyrocket to the rooftop, and it doesn't just happen for one price of a commodity. It goes around prices of every other thing. And when it does that, what happens to the purchasing power of the man on the street? There's a drastic drop in the purchasing power of the man on the street. If that happens in Nigeria, if that happens in Kenya, if that happens in Egypt and other African countries, then we can now turn our attention to budget performance. Because even recently in Nigeria, when we start looking at budget performance or the 2025 budget, about more than 50 trillion naira, and we say, okay, this is our budget. We've estimated about 13 trillion naira for a deficit.
Yes.
And we're looking at a 14 trillion naira for budget servicing.
Yes.
And we are looking at 24 trillion. And all these figures keeps coming on. And the price of crude oil, for which the budget, was designed, has fallen drastically.
Yes.
It's $75. But now we're dealing with less than $60 or $60. So we begin to ask the question. Economists will come and tell us, oh, Nigeria, the last time we rebased the economy was from 1999, and we did it to 2009 or 2010, thereabouts. Then we brought it to 2014. Then we brought it to 2025. We now rebased the economy to reflect what obtained in 2014 or 2024. And the intention for that, for the using of that year, because they felt that year was the specific year where the economy actually showed some form of resilience and stability and productivity. So we used that. Now, does it then defeat the argument that there is facing reality? Can we now pay our debt with the International Monetary Fund? Can we now service our debt? Does it not brought down the price of commodities in the market since we've rebased the economy? So it's just an artificial activity that the economists use to
on paper
to window dress the economy. So we should be hitting hard at the core of what Nigerians are facing, what Kenyans, what South Africans are facing, and how the leadership of each country need to bring out policies to reflect the earning power and the economic stability in their country.
They say in every situation, or post-COVID, let me start with COVID. COVID came like a blessing in disguise because it also gave birth to the IT, it gave room for IT, it gave room for remote jobs and all that. Now, that was when, inflation has always been, but that was when inflation really, really hit hard on most of the countries across the globe. We had the disruption of post-COVID. We had the rising fuel. Also, after post-COVID, we had rising fuel prices and food prices due to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Nigeria also suffered that. We also had global monetary policies. Now, looking at the local factors of inflation, we had currency depreciation, we had poor infrastructure, we also had heavy import duty dependency. We are a consuming nation, but do we really produce what we consume? That's another factor there. Then there's political instability. There's a whole lot that is causing inflation. Just like you rightly said, is the government in tune with the reality of things? Because I remember President Tinubu, I think last year during the independence, he made certain statements of how they've been able to reduce poverty, of how they've been able to do this and that. And Nigerians felt like, is he really talking from evidence? Is he really talking like this thing is actually happening? So inflation in itself, it's something, I think it's man-made, and I think it's something that we can actually address if we are really, really hell-bent on doing so. It started again when we had this back and forth with I'm talking about Nigeria, for instance, in a practical sense. When we had this whole wage increase, the Nigerian labor came out to say, okay, we want to increase the minimum wage to this, that. It was back and forth. And just when we thought that 75,000 would be okay, then fuel price went up. And Nigerians began to wail again. Now, there are so many things that is hidden in between this whole inflation. For instance, why is it that sometimes when you go to the market, if you buy rice today and you come back tomorrow, it's not the same price.
The price has changed.
The price has changed. So what is that factor that is influencing, that is making it go? And they say in Nigeria, things go up, it doesn't come down. So how can we actually tackle this? Yes, Lagos State came out with so many interventions. The food bank, the this, the that, the wage award. They came out with so many interventions to try as much as possible to streamline inflation. But experts also call that there should be some sort of price control. But can you actually control the price? Would you actually tell a manufacturer that, reduce the price of what you are selling when he knows the what he has incurred, the debt and every other thing he has incurred in manufacturing this, you will not come and tell him to reduce the price.
Donald Trump is doing that recently in the United States when it comes to drugs.
Yes, he's doing that, and all that. And, that's why he's saying America great again. We are also saying buy Nigeria first. So, I think we're on the same page with the United States and all that. But then we also need to look at the African free continental trade area. That should open up borders. That should actually really bring the price of goods down. But is it actually coming down? We discussed about, custom, impeding some of these things. We discussed about so many things. So it's a whole lot. But I think Nigeria is not the only place. We need to also actually look at other countries and see how they've been managing inflation and all that.
Okay, let me just turn my attention to Kenya. The last time Kenya rebased its economy in 2021. But before then, from 2001, the economy was rebased in 2001. Then from 2001, after 8 years, in 2019, in 2009 rather, they rebased their economy. And when Kenya rebased its economy, the economy became 25% bigger compared to their GDP. So they were let's just say they were in 9th position when we look at ranking some of the most productive and the most well-doing economies in Africa. They were in the 9th position. No, they were in the 12th position or so, in the 9th position. And after the rebasing the economy, they moved 4 steps higher.
Wow.
So the question we're asking is, okay, now that Kenya has rebased their economy, that means the implication is stating that their debt level compared to their gross domestic product has dropped drastically. So when the rebasing was done in Nigeria, as well, the consumer price index, moving from inflation, we're recording inflation level for about 34.8% during that time. After the rebasing of the economy by the National Bureau of Statistics, we moved from 34.8% inflation to about 24% inflation. So, no, yes, okay, fine, not bad. But okay, does it change the price of Gary in the market?
True. That's where the
that's why I call it from the onset window dressing. So, and when it does that, what's another implication? Another implication was that when Kenya rebased its economy, it means that their debt level compared to their gross domestic product had dropped drastically, and it dropped 24%. So when it dropped 24%, what are they trying to communicate to Kenyans? They are telling Kenyans that, look, compared to our debts, our debts that we are owing IMF and any other multilateral agency or governments or World Bank and so that we have borrowed from, it has not dropped. So now we have the liberty to take more debt because from our debt, compare our debt to our GDP, we are not doing bad at all. I think that's a deception. Now in Nigeria too, when the Nigerian economy was debased, we from 34.8%, now we went down to 24%. So in other words, what is the current administration saying? That they have the access, or they can justify the argument of the government to go to International Monetary Fund, to go to the World Bank to acquire more loans. But another question that should be asked is that, does that increase or makes healthy the purchasing power of the man? If the purchasing power of the man or the people on the street has not changed, then of what advantage is the rebasing of the economy? Because that is an instrument that most governments across the continent in Africa did. And when we rebase the economy, so one other important information or one other key critical area that I was trying to look at and to consider was that the borrowing percent will be taken down by the CBN. The profit margin or the profit for accessing loan will be taken down or reduced, but it was not. the CBN actually maintained it. So if the advantages only tilt towards the governing authorities and does not fall in favor of the investor, or does not augment the purchasing power of the man on the street, then I think it's high time we begin to ask, what are the advantages of rebasing the Nigerian economy or the economy of any other world? What does it bring to the coffers? Because if things are 90, if let's just say a bag of gari is about 50,000 naira,
Yeah,
for
50,
for
about
example,
50.
and you rebased the economy to reflect the period where there were stability in Nigerian economy, where the price of commodities were fair to the purchasing power of the Nigerian citizen. And now you've rebased the economy. Does it change the price of carry? Does it bring it down from 50,000 to 38,000 naira or to 40,000 naira? The answer is no. So we shouldn't be using rebasing of the economy as a yardstick because the government touts it around a lot. In Kenya, there was massive protest, and William Ruto had to sack the Inspector General of Police because he felt the massive protest was mismanaged.
Yes.
Because there was a conversation within the organs of government, the institutions of government, within the National Assembly, over there, the Parliament, of increasing tax.
Yes. I think one of the things we also need to look at is minimum wage, comparing it to other countries. Minimum wage in Nigeria, minimum wage in Ghana, Kenya, and maybe South Africa, to be able to understand the purchasing power. Minimum wage in Nigeria is 70 or 75, 70,000. So what can that 75,000, what can he actually do in a household of mother, father, and maybe two children? What can he actually do? Can he even pay school fees these days? I was told, a friend of mine was telling me about his other friend who resigned from his previous job, and I was asking why, and he said, well, they were paying him 35,000 naira for 2 years, and he just couldn't cope. He decided that let me just sit at home.
Was it in the civil service?
Not in the civil service, in the private sector.
Private sector.
Yes, for 2 years, someone being paid 35,000 naira. So what would that even do? Transportation has taken that away.
In Lagos?
In Ibadan.
Okay.
Transportation will probably take more than half of that. So can you even buy a bag of rice? No, you can't even buy a bag of rice.
Of course not.
Maybe a bucket paint of rice, if you are able to have something left to buy gari. We're not even talking any other thing. So that's one of the things that is making the purchasing power really weak. Because, I mean, if I cannot go to the market and be able to buy certain things.
Okay. Now, we've been having a conversation about the topmost 5-6 countries and economies in Africa and how inflation has affected them and how these have eroded the purchasing power of the Nigerian and in not just only Nigeria, in Kenya, in Ghana, in Sudan, in Ethiopia, and the likes. However, what else can we do to rectify these challenges? Is rebasing of the economy something that is, advantageous to the economy of a state? Or what exactly is the function of it? Does it have any bearing, any potential in the economy for it to be good? Or probably we are just meant to accept the new normal, even though it's not working in the favor of the people. Olumide, we were having a conversation, and I spoke extensively about Kenya and how they rebased their economy in 2009, and how that brought them from the 12th position to the 9th position, above Ghana and some other countries, but only below Sudan, which is an oil-producing economy. So the government makes policies about tax, and one of the influence that we have affecting some of the policies that the government makes that have a negative toll on the people of the country, most of them are coming from the IMF and the World Bank. I would say that the IMF, by way of advice, made the Nigerian government to remove fuel subsidy. And from the same IMF and World Bank, from the recent updates they gave about the government, or will I call them allegations, that they gave about the government's management of the economy, which is not impressive, and how the way that the 2025 budget is structured and our income, the potential for income has drastically reduced and gone down. And what means is the government going to make up for the imbalance and the shortfall? And there is this conversation about visiting the ways and means, which was used by the Buhari government during this time. We also don't want to go back there. Turning our attention to Kenya, the massive protest that came from Kenya did not only claim lives, but it sent a strong message to the government of the day that, look, in making policies, most especially economic policies that will touch the pockets and the lives of the ordinary citizens, you need to put into consideration what they feel.
The people.
The people. So we look at GDP and our definitions of development and economic growth. It's not premised on the gross domestic product, the per capita rise in per capita income, but it's the purchasing power. It's the purchasing power of the man on the street.
Yes.
Does it not work hand in glove with that, or is just that definition is just an esoteric and a theoretical concept that does not apply?
I think that's a rhetorical question you have said there, the purchasing power of the man. And, it's quite interesting when you look at Nigeria. We have so many things. We just did Cashcraft, and we're talking about the wealth, the benefits, business part of bitter cola. This is something that, if Nigeria looks into it alone, we could actually increase our productivity. I mean, it's not just about exporting it. Why not just go bring some of these international pharmaceutical companies, let them come and invest in Nigeria, or encourage local investors? Because once you bring in investors, they hire people, job employment. People are being paid. And once people are being paid, they have money in their pockets to be able to go into the market and purchase things. That is how it reflects. So whatever statement, whatever move, whatever policy the government does, they should always have it in mind, how it affects the common man. We would never forget the statement our president made on the inauguration day and how that gave birth to inflation on steroids, if I might permit me to say that. And, so many other statements, so many other policies they've been trying. They have been trying. Let's not, say they've not been trying. They've been trying, but it almost seems as if it's just trial and error. They don't really have people, advisors, experts, telling them what, and we seem to always believe what the World Bank and the IMF, and I seem to wonder why we are always taking them hook, line, and sinker. Now they're calling for the total removal of electricity subsidy. Yesterday we heard the report of how NNPC is being shortchanged. It's a whole lot. But in all, whatever policy any government of any institution coming up, always think of the common man and the purchasing power.
Well, we hope they do. Now we have our guest joining us. We are looking at inflation, which in inflation on one hand and the African consumer on the other hand, navigating the cost of living across African countries, a few of which we have mentioned. We have joining us Segun Sopitan. He is the principal partner, Woodedge and Scott Consulting. Good morning to you and welcome to Just Africa, Mr. Segun Sopitan.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Very much welcome. Now let's jump into the conversation. We are taking a look at inflation and the influence it has on the consumer and the purchasing power of the consumer in Nigeria, in Kenya, in Ghana, or any other African country that you can make references to. What's your perspective on this?
Well, I mean, the African continent is faced with a commonality of challenges. So you tend to see certain trends that are common across board, um, to a very large extent to some of these countries, especially when you look at sub-Saharan Africa, excluding South Africa. Um, the experience that we see now in Nigeria is actually kind of mirrored to a certain degree in places like Ghana, in places like Angola, um, Kenya to a lesser degree, but also they're grappling with the cost of living issues, and across board like that. And I think that what you find responsible for this will be the governance challenges that these countries tend to struggle with, the challenges with availability of data, formulation of policies that will guarantee economic development, expansion, and growth. In situations where those things are absent, likelihood is that you will see dislocations across board that will result in struggling with inflation numbers that are in double digits. It's typically you would say that it's an anomaly to see inflation rates, in 10, 20% percentile ranges. Ordinarily, the objective of every economy or economic managers across the world is to keep inflation rates at single digit as much as possible so that you can have price stability and so that businesses, investors, and other stakeholders that drive economic development can plan. So if you have prices increasing by as much as 20%, 30% year on year, then what it means is that every invoice that you are issuing per time, you've got to think very carefully about the figures that you're putting in there, and you've got to factor in the instability, which then has a ripple effect across the entirety of the economy, eventually dovetailing, down to the consumer and the average man on the street. So I think we're seeing that, across the African continent, and um, it's quite unfortunate. It shouldn't be that way, but it is what it is, and one can only hope that governments across, these countries will do a better job of managing those factors. And the factors vary across the different countries, what's resulting in inflation. So one would hope that governments across board would manage those factors in their different territories to make things a bit more livable for their citizens.
Right. Now, in 2001, Kenya rebased its economy, and the next time they did was in 2009. And when they actually did that, their GDP shot up excessively. Making comparison to Nigeria, recently we debased our economy, and which equally had the same effect. Our GDP went up, which means that the government at this point in time would justify the fact that it has not borrowed enough because our debt ratio compared to the GDP ratio would have excessively declined, and the government will use that as a permission to continue to borrow to service the economy. The same thing happened in Kenya. So we're beginning to look, whilst the government used GDP rebasing or rebasing of the economy to its own advantage, we've not been able to trace any advantage it will have on the purchasing power of the citizens in the country. So we begin to ask, of what significance does that economic tool, economic activity of rebasing the economy, of what significance is it if it does not have any bearing to the purchasing power or the economic well-being of the citizens of any of these African countries?
Very interesting question. I have, as I have looked around with some of the studies that I'm conducting, some of the reading that I'm doing, I'm coming to a very painful realization that we're approaching the entire governance question, including economic management, um, very wrongly as a continent, certainly as a country, but also as a continent. And I say this because some of the models that we have adopted and that we are using to drive policy making, to drive economic management, and to drive structures, across the economy, infrastructure development, and all of that. Those models are being used, have been in use, and are still being used by countries that are developed, that are stable. So if you say, for example, what GDP is in the United States or in the United Kingdom or in the EU, um, that number that you provide, is a real measure of economic activity within that territory, within that country, and every single aspect of it has an immediate impact on the average man on the street. So when you say there's a GDP growth rate of, say, 2% in the United States, the man on the street feels it directly because the lagging effect in those economies is very short. Um, um, Economic policies affect people very quickly because the economy is efficient. So if you say, for example, that you have increased the monetary policy rate by the Federal Reserve Bank in the United States, the impact of that is felt almost immediately across board, including in the supermarket shelves, on the shelves of supermarkets. And if you reduce the rate as well, you see an immediate impact, to the consumer. Because those economies are efficient. So when you make policies, those policies percolate down to the people very quickly. In Africa, it's a very different thing. Our economies are extremely inefficient, partly and significantly because of corruption, which provides a distortionary effect on everything that governments are doing. So what you find is that economic development is non-inclusive. So when you say you rebase your GDP, for example, in other parts of the world, these exercises happen very frequently, such that the changes are not significant in short spaces of time. So you won't see, if the United States says it wants to rebase its economy, you're not going to see a doubling of the GDP numbers. It's not going to double, because this is something they do frequently. And in any case, the room for growth in those economies is very limited because of the efficiencies that already exist there. So you take that story back to Africa, and we say we've rebased, and all of a sudden your economy has moved from 200 billion US dollars, overnight. You are suddenly on 440 billion dollars, and you become the biggest economy in Africa just like that. That growth in your GDP numbers is completely irrelevant to the man on the street, to the vulcanizer, to the barber, to the hairdresser, and every other artisanal worker, people in the informal sector especially. They don't feel it at all because development is non-inclusive. The trickle-down effect that is supposed to drive the creation of wealth, increased purchasing power in the pockets of the average African, it doesn't happen. The money doesn't trickle down. So what you find is that these numbers, we bandy them around, but they really, really don't mean very much, in terms of the impact on the average person on the street. We've got to begin as a continent to look at a different model for driving economic development and economic growth. We're talking about heavy infrastructure spending, talking about significantly cutting out the impact of corruption across the continent. Because what you have is that, if a government cuts a budget of, let's say, $32 billion, as in the case of Nigeria, in some instances, 30% of that money, maybe 50% of that money, never actually goes to the purpose that it was designed for. So you lose the opportunity that is inherent in that spending, in affecting the average person on the street. So we really have structural problems that prevent economic growth and development from affecting people. We've got to deal with this.
All right, thank you very much. I have two questions for you quickly. The first question is, which of the Nigerian economic policies have worked or is working to stabilize or maybe increase the purchasing power of the common man in Nigeria? And second, the African Free Continental Trade Area, of what benefit do you think this would be in the nearest future in reducing inflation across countries?
Okay, so to take the first one, talking about increasing the purchasing power of the average person on the street, you can't address that question without first of all providing a context, some sort of contextual approach to it. You've got to look at where we're coming from. So if you say which policy is potentially helping to improve the purchasing power of the people, struggle to find any at the moment because typically what you would look at are basic, numbers like interest rates. Okay, so what's the CBN doing to try and manage interest rates? What's the CBN doing to try and manage inflation? You look at basic items, within the basket, the purchasing basket of the average Nigerian, and those items that impact their um, purchasing power and disposable income the most. And you find that because of the inefficiencies in our electricity situation, petrol is a major one. So whatever you do to bring the cost of petrol down is going to have an immediate impact, on the pockets of the people. So the trend that we've seen since the introduction of Dangote refinery and the Naira for crude policy that has seen price of petroleum products dropped from as high as 1,100 just a few months ago to now 890, and there's news now that that might be going down to somewhere around 850. That will definitely have an impact on purchasing power. However, the reason I spoke about context is that impact is nowhere near enough given where we're coming from. And I think that ultimately, whatever policies that the government implements, it's got to be about making the lives of people better. Even if you say there's going to be long-term benefits, you have to deal with the short-term effects and find ways to mitigate them. So a situation where you've seen purchasing power reduced by more than 80, 90% in a short space of time is very poor economic management. And what you find that we've been doing in the last 2 years is that we'll be fighting fires, trying to put out fires that we set ablaze by ourselves. So that's why I say I would struggle to find any policy to say, oh, it's helping to improve purchasing power, because in the first instance, um, I like to say that Nigerians were fine where they were. So talking about trying to fix structural challenges of the economy, and all that, and then taking subsidies away, floating the naira, those are high polluting ideas that the average man on the street don't understand, and that really doesn't impact them. So when you are doing those things, you've got to look at the impact on the average man and how to mitigate the effect of those things. If you fail to do that, then it's unfortunate.
All right. The second question was what role would the African Free Continental Trade Area, what role would it play in also reducing inflation across countries?
Well, unfortunately, for now, I doubt that we're going to see any remarkable, noticeable impact, simply because integration on the continent is very weak. And the primary objective of that agreement is to actually improve intracontinental trade, which ideally is supposed to then improve economic activity. If I'm producing shoes in Nigeria and I can easily move them to Kenya, not Ghana, not Benin Republic, that are my next door neighbors, but if that agreement opens up the entire African market such that my volumes increase, I sell more, I make more, and my disposable income increases, then it will be a good thing. But the challenge is the things that need to be in place to make that agreement have the kind of impact that it could are not being addressed. Bilateral air service agreements, for example, freedom of movement of people and services. You can't say you've got a continental free trade zone when I can't go to Kenya, I can't go to Angola, I can't go to South Africa without a very stringent visa process. So those things actually have a direct impact and bearing on the free trade concept. Also, infrastructure. If you go to Europe, for example, you can get on a train in London, and London is an island. Is in United Kingdom that is an island. You get on a train and you find yourself in France, in Germany, within an hour, within an hour and a half. That's integration by infrastructure. So what that does immediately is that the movement of goods and services and people becomes seamless, and therefore you can then talk about freedom of trading. We don't have that in Africa. We've been talking about a trans-Sahara, highway forever, for as long as I've been alive, and it's never happened. So until we deal with those integration issues, policy integration, infrastructure integration, even economic integration to a certain degree, talking about numbers, inflation rates, balance of trade, and those types of things. This free trade agreement is just going to continue to be something, a nice concept on paper, but I don't think that we're going to see the kind of impact that it should be having until we deal with these issues.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Segun Sopitan. Now, one thing that comes to mind is that when there is surging inflation in many African countries, one of the economic policy that the central banks of these countries, whether it's Bank of Ghana or the Central Bank of Nigeria or that of South Africa or Kenya, one of the actions they always adopt is to increase the monetary policy rate, which is the benchmark for interest rate for businesses and investors, in order to, constrain the supply of money into the economy. And people have been asking the question that this specific method or instrument of controlling inflation is rather stifling the economy, and it's not working for the economy. That's why recently the NPR rate in Nigeria is 27.50%. In Ghana, it's about 27%. South Africa and Kenya equally have theirs, and their intention is to restrain the supply of money into the economy without determining if the inflation was demand push or supply push. What's your perspective to this?
A brilliant question. And again, I look at this issue as unfortunately a copy and paste approach to economic management. Again, we are adopting practices and models that are used in economies and countries that are stable, that are balanced, that are developed. So you find that you apply those policies on the African continent, and they don't work. So let's focus on Nigeria because we live here and we can feel everything that is happening. The CBN has been increasing monetary policy rates for 2 years now. 2 years. Since 2022 December was the first time that they hiked, and they've been hiking until they then held the last MPC meeting because inflation numbers have come down, in quotes, right? But in that time, as they've been increasing the monetary policy rate, inflation has followed it. Inflation has been increasing. It's supposed to have been the opposite effect. And the reason for that, again, is the inefficiencies in our economy, the fact that, like you said, and I know that the CBN is kind of aware of this, but they it almost feels as if their hands are tied and they just have to apply the textbook approach, right? So, like you said, you've got to look at whether your inflation is cost push or demand pull. So, if your inflation is demand pull, then you can claim that this is driven by money supply. The basic economic concept that they taught us in secondary school. Oh, inflation is too much money, chasing too few goods. So if you have a constraint on production for whatever reason, either because there's a constraint on the factors of production like electricity, or because of insecurity in the middle belt, which is really our food basket, and you have at the same time an increase in money supply, then you've got a confused situation where monetary policy rate alone cannot fix. So the CBN has been increasing monetary policy rate, and inflation has just stubbornly continued to go up. Because what's driving it is not just money supply. So that's the reason that it doesn't work. we have to look at our own peculiar situation and address our peculiar economic challenges with homegrown, custom-built, custom-developed management, economic management policies, rather than doing copy and paste from the Western world where the economies are far more stable, far more predictable, and far more developed. So for example, if the CBN wants to target inflation, yes, money supply is high, and that's a fact. It's still increasing. You've got to ask yourself why. What's driving money supply? And at the bottom of that question, if you go check, there is a direct correlation between the floating of the naira, the fact that every dollar gets you far more naira now, and you tie that to FAC allocations that happen every month, and the fact that we hear, these are not things that you can prove necessarily, but that, the governors take those allocations and buy dollars immediately. So, that creates chaos from a policy planning point of view, because it's something that you can't even plan for. So how can the CBN deal with that? Increasing monetary policy rate is never going to address that. So until we've got economic managers and maybe governance models that are honest and that deals with our peculiarities as a continent, with candor, with honesty, with sincerity, we'll just continue to fly and bandy these numbers and these concepts. We'll come on TV and talk about them. And nothing will change. Look, we've been having these types of conversations. I've been doing this for 10 years, and we've been having the same conversations. It's a bit tiring, to be honest.
So one more last question from me. And the President Bola Tinubu administration, did something that is peculiar to its government, which I've not really perceived was an ambition that was set by previous administration. And that in its economic plan is that Nigeria becomes a $1 trillion economy. So do you think, in your perspective, we might get there? But if you think that we might get there, what do you hope to see that will reflect in the economic power of the common man on the street if we are to attain the $1 trillion economy? Maybe you can briefly answer that.
Great. So if we're going to achieve that, you would by now have been seeing certain very practical, pragmatic steps, aggressive, well-coordinated, well-articulated plans towards achieving this. And of course, you also have to put a time frame to it. And I think that what the president said was by 2030. 2030 is 5 years from now. It's not that far. So for us to hit $1 trillion by 2030 without rebasing, because that's another way that you could achieve that. So if it's going to be based on actual economic growth, it would mean that you would have to pretty much double your GDP, in a 5 years. We're around $440 billion now, right? So it would mean you would double that in 5 years. In order to achieve double that in 5 years, just split that, just a simple arithmetic, you'll be talking about 20% every year from now, 20% GDP growth rate. Now, it's unachievable. But even if you shoot, like some will say, if you shoot for the stars and you hit the moon, you've still done something good. So let's assume we don't achieve 1 trillion and we can do, say, $700 billion in the next 4 or 5 years. You might say that's a measure of success. However, in order for that to happen, a few things need to be happening. And that will tie to the question you asked about the impact of this on the common man. For that to happen, I have said, and I'm going to say again, Nigeria needs to become one big construction site. One of the signs of economic development is activity. You are going to see things happening around you. You are going to see structures going up, buildings going up. You're going to see roads being built. You're going to see bridges being built. You are going to have electricity in abundant supply, either from the traditional sources or maybe from renewables. You will see concerted effort and you will see a well-orchestrated channeling of capital into projects that will then trickle down. Because when you are running those projects, it's human beings that are going to be a part of the value chain. So that will result in money, and in wealth for the people. But you can't see anything like that right now. All you are hearing are, sound bites on TV, and all of that. So I don't see it happening unless something radical changes.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Segun Sopitan. Mr. Segun Sopitan is let me get his right designation for that effect. He is a principal partner, Woodedge and Scott Consulting. Thank you so much, Segun Sopitan, for gracing the occasion this morning in Just Africa and giving your perspective in issues. I think you've done justice to the topic of conversation this morning. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Have a wonderful day.
You too. Okay, so one significant thing he mentioned is when he was responding to the last two questions, and the very last question he responded to, he talked about if we are going to attain the $1 trillion economy, which I think, even though an ambitious economic plan that has been put in place by this administration, that I think it's yet something that is laudable in the sense that now there is a plan, there's an objective, there's an aim, there's a goal that's been put in place. So we need to attain it. So all other economic plan that is going to come must be driving the nation's economy to that. Kenya itself as an economic plan, because I remember very well when William Ruto was being sworn into office, and the expectation was quite high. But like every other government, it met its own pitfalls and its own challenges, and it has not been really going smoothly for that administration. Is it in South Africa? Or South Africa is a major manufacturing hub.
Yes.
It has more than 300 companies listed in its capital market,
yes.
Quoted companies. So it's doing very well, and I think it is the market in the African economy that have market capitalization of $1.3 trillion, and Nigeria comes barely about $40 billion. Ghana, they're about $33 billion. Talk about Morocco, the Asian African nations too, not doing badly. So when we look at this, if we are going to attain the $1 billion economy, like he said, we must be achieving 20% of our foreign reserve, which is about $40 billion, $400 billion. We need to be attaining 20% for that for 5 years. And even if we can't meet that, let's say 2030 comes, we should be able to do $700 billion. And with the way you're laughing, if that's
it's a beautiful sight you would want to see. But looking at government continuum, that's where my mind was going. You said 2030. Even within the same administration, when this administration came in, they changed a whole lot of policies. You understand? So if we're to achieve this $1 billion economy, it also depends on continuum, how these policies would be streamlined, would be maintained, so that come another administration from any other political of the opposition, they would follow this blueprint. It's all about following this blueprint. If we're able to follow this blueprint, and with the new policy of buy Nigeria first and all that, we are in the right direction. It's just about management. I think that's just it. It's just management and political will to achieve these things. Yes.
Okay. Well, on that occasion, we have come to the end of Just Africa this morning. We'll be leaving, but we're not leaving completely. We'll leave you in the hands of our last report. And that report is conveying you straight to Lesotho. It's about a kingdom in the sky. That name alone should make you curious and want to watch that. I'm Oyinpreye Krumale. Good morning to you. Many thanks for watching.
And I am Olumide Sokoya. Many thanks for watching.
Lesotho, a country like no other on the African continent, and in fact, like no other in the world. Nestled entirely within the borders of South Africa, Lesotho holds a unique geographical distinction. It is the only independent nation on Earth located entirely above 1,000 meters in elevation. Its lowest point, at 1,400 meters above sea level, is higher than the highest points in countries like Netherlands, Denmark, or even the United Kingdom. This extraordinary altitude earns Lesotho its nickname, the Kingdom in the Sky. Lesotho is one of just 3 countries in the world that are completely surrounded by one other country, the others being San Marino and Vatican City in Italy. But unlike them, Lesotho is not a microstate. It boasts a proud population, a strong cultural identity, and a landscape marked by rugged mountains, deep valleys, and fast-flowing rivers. What also makes Lesotho stand out in Africa is its climate. While much of the continent is known for its warmth, Lesotho regularly experiences snowfall, especially in its highland regions. In fact, it is home to Afriski, Africa's only ski resort south of the equator, drawing tourists who seek winter sports in an unlikely location. But Lesotho's uniqueness goes beyond geography and weather. The Basotho people are known for their iconic wool blankets, worn with pride across the country. These are not just for warmth, they are deeply symbolic, representing milestones, rites of passage, royalty, and social status. No traditional ceremony is complete without the presence of these beautifully patterned and color-coded blankets. The traditional Basotho hat, or mokrotlo, is another national symbol, so important that it appears on the country's license plates and currency. Lesotho also harnesses the power of its water. Its Lesotho Highlands Water Project exports fresh mountain water to South Africa while generating electricity for domestic use. Water, often called white gold, is one of the country's most valuable resources. In many ways, Lesotho defies expectations. It is a country of heights, both literal and cultural. In a continent known for deserts and plains, Lesotho offers snow and slopes. In a region often shaped by lowland agriculture, Lesotho rises up proud, elevated, and unshaken. Lesotho is not just unique to Africa, it is unique to the world. This is the uniqueness of Africa, and today we spotlight Lesotho, the Kingdom in the Sky. I'm Moyosore Adebi for Souk News TV.